So just a little bit of a preface here. I'd been working on this level for about a week or so, mostly just to teach myself a little bit about level design, lighting and general environment creation in Unreal Engine 4. As you can see, the level is just a generic spaceship scene. The meshes and textures are community content, but everything else in the level was designed and implemented by me. I originally intended to spend a good amount of time delicately designing the separate atmospheres of the ship and slap it up on my website as a piece of portfolio work, but there's already environmental sound design on there, both as redesigns and implementation using Unreal and/or Wwise, so I figured I'd do something a little different. I decided that would be more interesting if I held myself to a deadline of 1 week. This way I don't waste any time spending 3 hours EQing room tones, and I also set myself somewhat of a personal benchmark. So I feel I should say that before we hop into the Wwise project, that this definitely isn't the best audio implementation I can do. Obviously some of it is a little rushed and many of the original recordings aren't my own. A lot of it is samples that I've edited down and processed to fit the theme of the level. So getting into Wwise, not a big point here, but the room tones themselves are made up of blend containers. Sometimes these have a random or a sequence container included to produce small sweeteners. Typically, the room tones that you hear are 2 loops of different lengths which produce a complete asynchronous room tone. Some of these are also manipulated by RTPCs just to adjust the characteristics of the room as the player moves around the environment. All the room tones and door sound events use a defined attenuation share set. For the doors, I would just assign the share set and then leave them as is, as I generally want these to all behave roughly the same. But the attenuation scale factor for all the room tones had to be adjusted according to the room that they were situated in. Whilst we're on room attenuation, I understand that acoustic portals are kind of the way to go if you want to diffuse sound through passageways, but I honestly haven't quite figured these out yet, and since I was set to my own deadline, I didn't really want to be spending any more time than a couple of hours trying to figure out how these work. So I used a little bit of a trick to fake doorway diffusion. In the attenuation settings for each room tone, a spread curve was created to fold the stereo room tone down into mono as the player gets further away from the source. By the time the player is at the edge of the attenuation sphere, which is set to be when the player is outside of the room tone can be heard as a mono source with orientation panning applied. You do lose out on some of the fancy diffusion stuff that Acoustic Portals provide, but this is a pretty cheap and easy way to simulate the effect. And of course the doors are set to be collidable objects, therefore occlusion filtering is applied to the sound source when the doors close. All the rooms have a unique auxiliary bus which applies a defined reverb that matches the room. There's nothing special going on here, I just implemented the reverb zones in Engine, assigned the matching auxiliary bus and ensured that all the ambiences would use the game defined auxiliary sounds. When it came to mixing the project, I made use of the mixer layout to roughly dial in the mix I wanted for each room. Down below in the Soundcaster, I also included the room tone events of the opposite rooms to ensure I was mixing relative to the rest of the level. As I stated earlier, this was a time challenge of sorts, and because of that I wasn't too worried about using other people's samples, as I was more focused on quick results rather than originality. Although I did include some of my own field recordings in there, as I think my fridge makes a pretty great neon light bulb sound. But ultimately this did mean that I was dragging large WAV files into the project and creating a huge strain on memory when playing the level. To reduce this strain, all the audio was converted into the Vorbis format at a passable quality, and I just let Wwise pick the sample rate as it generally does a pretty okay job. These settings were then saved as a share set so I could quickly apply them to all new project audio. You may have noticed that there's only one sound bank in use. I did try containing environmental audio in separate sound banks, but I was experiencing an issue with Unreal finding my newly generated sound banks. This seems to be a known bug as others have written about it on the forums. I just thought I'd mention it as you may have wondered why I'm not using a trigger in the level to load and clear sound banks during the gameplay. I did try, but to no avail. So instead, I relied more upon voice culling through playback limits and priority settings. As many of the sounds are ambiances, there wasn't much point in limiting these instances, as not many of the sounds are getting spawned. In one case though, there are 12 neon light bulbs in the airlock, and attempting to play them all was causing voice starvation, so these were limited to 6 instances. Almost all of the voices are set to become virtual voices when the player leaves the attenuation radius. On screen you can see just how bad the issue with physical voices was, compared to how it is now. Also, just a small thing to note, but setting the room tones to stream from hard disk freed up a huge amount of memory during runtime. And that's about it. The rest of the video will just be a playthrough of the level so you can hear what it sounds like. Thanks for watching.